having a wonderful lineup of speakers this morning who are going to shed light on the PPP industry from different viewpoints and perspectives. Let us go to our first presentation and the first speaker. Our first speaker is a researcher in the Government and Public Management Program at the Mhamed Biygautane School of Government, specializing on governance, public management, and sustainable economic growth of the UAE and MENA region. He has published more than 70 studies on political economy of development, knowledge management, and training in public sector. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Mhamed Biygautane.
First of all, thank you very much for showing up for this early presentation. Basically, what I'm going to talk about is public-private partnerships in the Gulf cooperation countries. Being a researcher, I think I will focus more on the challenges than the opportunities that PPPs offer the region. And I think there is no better quote, perhaps, to start this presentation than what Professor Graham Hodge, Global Authority in Public-Private Partnerships, once said when he said this is an era of public-private partnerships. It's no longer public versus private, but rather public and private sector entities both working to provide the best value for the public. When we have effective public policies and efficient public-private practices, we tend to have, as I said, better policies and better public value in general. So the outline of my presentation, I have only 30 minutes, and I think it's a very short time to introduce all of these concepts and ideas. I will go very briefly through a definition and significance of public-private partnerships, especially within the current international financial climate of dwindling budgets. Then I will go through advantages and disadvantages of PPPs, and the central question we'll be asking is, are PPPs agreements invariably the best solution for funding infrastructure projects? Are the advantages of PPPs more than the advantages, or the other way around? Then I will move immediately to talk about frameworks that are necessary for PPPs successful operations, because PPPs don't work everywhere, and that's the thing we should bear in mind throughout all these presentations. The PPPs need certain environmental and frameworks that need to be in place before we implement them. Then I will move to talk about the benefits of PPPs in general, specifically for GCC's economies that are trying to focus more on investment and trying to rely less on oil and natural resources. Then I will finish with talking about some opportunities PPPs will bring to the GCC's economies, especially if we look at their economic portfolios in general. So, to define public-private partnerships, they come under the umbrella of new public management doctrine that appeared in the UK in the 1980s, and up to now there is no consensus on what public-private partnerships means, and this is why we see different definitions in different contracts based on their nature and the field they focus on. But generally speaking, we can say that PPPs are the business relationship with the private sector. It is sometimes long or short term, with risks and returns being shared between the two, public and private. They take many forms, either design, contract, and maintain. We don't see this much in the Gulf region, but the two other categories we see existing the most are build, own, and operate. And the first contract was signed in 1994 in Oman, and it was then we have build, own, operate, and transfer, and also we see a lot of examples of these cases in Abu Dhabi and UAE, and they don't have a lot of time to go in detail talking about other examples, but I would be happy to do so during the question session. And when you compare between the advantages and disadvantages of PPPs, as I mentioned earlier, we must admit that as long as there are successful PPP cases, there are failures, there are unsuccessful ones, and it all relies on having the proper environment where PPPs can operate effectively and efficiently, and they generally yield positive results and create value for money when they have a proper environment. And then if we're talking about advantages of PPPs, we're talking about access to skills, and this is what GCC needs more than money. And it enables greater transfer of risks at each phase to the party that can handle the risk better, either private or public. The payment of services depends largely on delivery of services and also the quality of services. This is where sometimes public and private differ in their expectations. And in terms of disadvantages, there are a lot, but mostly we're talking about the complexity of contracting requirements. This is a very expensive, actually, endeavor for the public sector, especially when deciding what terms to put in contracts and so on. Not all risks can be transferred cost-effectively to the private sector, and there are also a lot of cases of disputes, that we can talk about later on. As I said, PPPs require significantly enabling factors, especially three segments here. The legal framework. The success of PPPs as a tool is determined by having dedicated legal framework, and this is what is absent in the region. Generally speaking, we don't see legal frameworks. And also governance and supervisory frameworks are essential to enable PPPs to yield the best results. So I will move to talking about the factors that contribute to the success or failure of PPPs in general. And the most important one is the transparency and accountability of the tendering process, also having a stable policy regime, reputation, trust, and motivation of both the public and the private entities. What leads to unsuccessful cases of PPPs, again, the most important one is accountability and transparency, lack of government commitment, and also objectives, complex decision-making processes, and heavy bureaucracies. These are all actually factors that lead to PPPs to fail eventually. When we talk about benefits of PPPs, there are numerous. The first basically benefit we could talk about is the fiscal ones. Governments can use the funds for other social benefits, like spending on education and health and other sectors, rather than focusing on infrastructure, especially the case for most of many countries that have a lot of deficits in affording PPPs. And this is why we see the World Bank trying to encourage countries of the MENA, especially Morocco and Tunisia and Algeria, to empower an environment that encourages PPP in general. Risk allocation also, and it's a key factor in the value for money argument, as private sector handles risks better, not all the time again. Economic benefits, PPPs promise to increase efficiency by decreasing time and cost, and again, the entire argument behind new public management field is to introduce the best practices of the private sector to the public. Social benefits, as I said, PPPs improve service coverage. Also, they enable the needed infrastructure that might not otherwise be available due to budgetary constraints. And last one is technological benefits, especially in areas in which hosting countries lack the necessary expertise. I'm not getting it. If we look at if we have a general overview of the GCC countries' economic and investment profiles, as I said, there is still a huge deficit in terms of the availability of necessary infrastructure for development. And here we see the effect of the impact of the financial crisis, the dwindling budgets that are necessary to build the necessary infrastructure, and also the dependence on prices of oil. All these can be basically handled properly if the private sector gets involved in the provision of services. Something happened to the presentation. So perhaps I will continue to talk about the opportunities that PPPs will bring to GCC economies. As we see, technology is not always reliable. So basically, GCC's countries' economic profiles make PPPs an attractive transformation mechanism, especially these days. We see the boom that is taking place again in Dubai, and we see how Dubai learned from the mistakes, I would say, of the past, and is now trying to empower more the involvement of the private sector in providing services. We see a lot of mega projects taking place not only in Dubai and UAE, but also in Saudi Arabia and Qatar. And two things are required: first, the funding, and second, the expertise and transfer of knowledge. Then we've also seen the launch of smart cities also in Dubai, and this inescapably needs the expertise of IT companies like IBM and I think Siemens. Also then in areas like healthcare, education, and other areas, having PPP partnerships with private sector are, I think, essential. Also Dubai Expo, it needs money and needs I think they say Dubai Expo needs money, and also the government of Dubai is struggling financially to cover other projects, and involving the private sector in this endeavor will be an opportunity. Also, GCC governments want to reduce their natural resource dependence and develop their private sectors and introduce foreign capital into vibrant areas of their economies, and having the opportunity for the funds to be available for private sector entities will definitely help in this. Also, it has a lot of potential to improve national competitiveness through attracting global companies with transferable skills and best practices. And as I mentioned earlier, the difference between the MENA countries and GCCs in terms of what kind of PPP contracts they enter into is the MENA countries need the funding, while the GCC ones need expertise and the transferability of skills. If we look at GCC countries' economic and investment profiles, these are statistics from around 2 years ago. We see that Qatar, around 55% of its GDP relies on non-oil sectors. In UAE, 71%. And we see the trend is growing. GCC countries want to rely less on as I said, natural resources, and it's inescapable to involve the private sector and learn the best mechanisms and tools to do so. Also, as I said, GCC's intention to reduce the size of the government in the economy, and also more importantly to transfer into knowledge economy, it's an undeniable fact that the private sector has to be the big player, and also the government sector has to play a smaller role in the provision of services. Also, over the past 10 years, more than 100 infrastructure projects have been developed in the GCC region, unfortunately with no clear frameworks. And also there are few studies. I mean, if we try to look for the mistakes that have been learned in the past experiences, we wouldn't find many published studies, and I think that's essential to learn from other experiences. Water management projects, airports and hospitals are the major forms of PPPs in Abu Dhabi, in Oman, in Dubai recently, and in Qatar. And in the coming 10 years, GCC countries are set to spend over $500 billion in national development plans, and getting the necessary funding is the main prerequisite. And I think again, the private sector will play a significant role in this. And it's also safer, I think, relying on PPPs, given the contextual factors that exist in the region, is much more useful than privatization. Again, just a slight idea about the investment profiles in the region. Kuwait and Qatar metro projects are due in the next 10 years, and as I said, they would cost around $7 billion to $25 billion. Again, where are we going to get this money from? And can we assure that we can deliver the value we promise to the public by this investment? And the private sector promises again to be accountable for that. Saudi Arabia began a $385 billion 5-year development plan in 2010, and it's still going on. Kuwait launched a 4-year development plan worth $104 billion. Qatar does the same, and Abu Dhabi government implemented successful PPPs in water and electricity services, which is becoming a benchmark in the entire Gulf region. Now, I will talk a little bit more on challenges of establishing PPPs in the region. The Gulf region and the MENA in general lag behind in using PPPs as a framework for delivering public services. Relying on some statistics I got from the World Bank, around 40% of PPPs take place in Europe, around 20% in Asia, 11% in Latin America, and only 4% in the Middle East. And again, as I said, this is due to a lot of factors, mostly due to the absence of enabling environments, especially in terms of regulatory policies, legal frameworks that don't exist in most of GCC and many countries, laws governing PPPs in the Gulf, except in Kuwait, that established a specific PPP law in 2008. Because, as I said, when we talked about risks, the private sector tends to take a bigger portion of the risk, and therefore it wants to ensure that it has enough legal frameworks that can protect it in case of disputes. Also, the PPP contracts, as we know, are sometimes very long-term ones, up to from 20 to 30 years. So without proper legal frameworks, it's a very risky business for the private sector to be involved in a contract of this magnitude. Most of the projects we see in the GCC are done on an ad hoc basis through consulting companies. And as I said, since there are not enough studies that can tell us from which we can learn the best and worst practices, we don't learn from the mistakes or from the lessons we draw from previous projects. Also, absence of political will to give up ownership of projects in some sensitive areas, and also the absence of central units to administer PPPs. In the Gulf, many government entities are in charge of administering PPPs, and this bureaucratic burden is what discourages again many private entities from getting involved in a PPP contract. The rule of law and governance in some many countries in general poses a challenge again to encourage private entities, and a lack of talent and skills in the region also poses a heavy challenge on consulting companies that try to implement a PPP, especially from the part of the public sector. And lack of trust from Western companies regarding transparency of the bidding process is also indicated in many studies when we look at the challenges that PPPs require, and also poor communication and sometimes vague contracts from both the public and the private sector. And then the high participation costs are also a challenge, and I think that I will try to stop here and give the chance to my colleague. If you have any questions, I will be happy to answer them afterwards. Thank you very much.